I think it's always a hard time whenever someone is tasked with a project based around an actual celebrity's life, especially a life filled with so many eventful moments and so much context which are needed in order to truly understand that person. Yet at the end of the day, if that tedious work is done, it can produce something that is truly great. But I feel like in the case of this movie, it was mishandled to the point that it didn't get to live up to being the film that it could have been. And to be honest with you, it's not anyone's fault in particular. It's just really hard to tell a story of such a prominent figure in Elvis Presley within 2.5 hours alone. For those who haven't seen this film, this movie is a reflection of Elvis Presley's life in a sense, as he rises from a poor boy from Memphis to a global megastar. This success didn't come without a price, however, as he faced many controversies throughout his career. You have his initial terrible public perception that led to him losing himself along the process, to him getting a first-hand look at the dangers of exploitation that faced him as an artist, being personified as his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. Stresses that build up and over time and ultimately lead to his demise at the age of 42. Now, I'm not saying that this movie was horrible by any regards. I believe that they did the best with what they were given in many aspects, and it panned out very well sometimes. Such as the cast, which I think was a very good conglomerate of actors who really put their all into their performances. Austin Butler really nails a lot of Elvis's mannerisms, from the little intricacies in his movements, his accent. I would say a huge highlight was especially his stage performances and the flamboyance and sometimes provocative yet entertaining nature that Elvis had in real life. Tom Hanks really wants you to hate him. And that means that he's doing his job spot on, because him as Colonel Tom Parker was just something to watch, something to behold, you know. He really hit the nail on this desperate yet prideful manipulator that the Colonel was in real life. You know, he was this illegal citizen, didn't have much to his name, but never publicly showed his vulnerability. I also found it quite poetic that going through this movie, just knowing that he is this unreliable narrator, doing the same thing to the audience that he did to Elvis and everyone else in his life, in manipulating the story or the narrative to fit his agenda. I also want to give a shout out to Helen Thompson, who did a really good job embodying that spirit of a simple mother that just wants the best for her kid mentally. She was really that groundness in a sense that contradicts the sky shooting views of the Colonel. It was just such a great act. Away from the casting, another positive was simply the musical performances, as I mentioned earlier. Like, the best parts of the film were highlighting the musical aspects of Elvis's career, you know. Even when not Elvis himself, the Little Richard performance was also very nice to see. And I also appreciate the reality of the fact that it shows that Elvis was not looked at as a person, but a figure for others to gain off of. This concept is just ultimately all too common in the industry. Public saw him as an icon, so they would hound him when they could, which makes the repeated use of hound dog in this movie makes total sense in context. Women in particular saw him as a sexual object. You of course have the Colonel and many people closely associated with him, seeing him as this means to an end in regards to wealth. And so the story is not necessarily the life and death of a man, but rather one finally being humanized in the end. This movie has a lot of good themes, however, too many good themes to play with at times, to the point that the cracks start to show as this movie goes along its structure. Like, for example, this movie can best be described as inconsistent. It can be seen throughout the central themes that this movie wants to tackle. It can be seen in the movie's pacing. It can even be seen in what era of music being played at the time, as it cuts from an Elvis song to a Doja Cat remix, which I would like to add quite literally does nothing to this film whatsoever. It makes even less sense when you realize that this movie is about an artist many see as the king, surrounded by other amazing and influential artists around this time, so they had a lot of content to pull from. So why would you even consider pulling from a more modern artist? This movie ultimately splits up into two parts in my eyes: the rise of Elvis and the fall of Presley. And one half is significantly more flawed than the other half, and it just so happens to be the start of the film. The rise of Elvis genuinely had me questioning if I was watching a trailer for the movie, as the pacing was just so awfully quick. Like, we no joke go from him arguing with his mom about doing anything to reach his goal of success and getting his family out the struggle, to him being out of the struggle like 10, 15, 20 minutes later. We don't actually get to see the overwhelming amount of struggle that drives Elvis to be Elvis in the first place. We sort of just cut it up, and eventually he's just successful. They also frequently broke the fundamental rule of films so many times as they told us a lot of information more than it was shown. Like early in their film, we were given most of his progression as an artist through the projection of newspaper headlines and lines that were referenced things that weren't even shown on screen. This eventually gets to the fall of Presley, which was slightly better done as they slowed down the pacing and allowed us to truly take in the story at hand. It had its flaws, but it was significantly better than the first. We actually get to see the progression of his career through his performances, and we get to see the physical strain that the music industry puts on his body. The pressure to maintain in top condition for weeks on end, for years, leads to his frequent drug use, that which leads to the decline of his health and leads to the separation of his family, that of which pushes him to into a spiral that he only sees fit to fix with money, drugs, women, thus completing this full cycle. Like, it's almost poetic in the last performance on screen, as it wasn't this otherworldly, energetic man that we've grown accustomed to, but this simple guy sitting in a chair, barely able to sit up, yet doing what he's always done and pouring his heart into a microphone. And it's a shame that the rest of this movie could not be so well put together, but like I said, when you're talking about such a polarizing and eventful life, it's hard to just fit all of that within 2.5 hours. Like every scene, for the most part, it serves a purpose towards an overall plot, whether foreshadowing a character's fate or just contextualizing the time period as a whole. The problem is that even more needs to be added for this to seem like a complete Elvis story. So your only solutions really are to restrict the amount that this movie will actually cover, or to extend it to like a 3-4 hour movie, which either decision comes with its conflicts. Like, you can't tell an Elvis story without context, because that's essentially his career, whether that be the culture shock that he was to many people in the mainstream, with the political figures frequently attempting to turn him to this clean-cut all-American guy. Or you can talk about the base of his career and how his style can be attributed to many different African Americans, and how some can even say he stole that style and made a name off of it, unrightfully so. You also need the context of the time period he lived in, which was segregated at the time and saw the death of many beloved figures such as Dr. King and the effect that it had on the nation. Most importantly, you need the context that he wasn't the perfect man, as he has done things like steal, he has done things like cheat on his wife, but he was also a person that looked out for his family and made sure that his circle was taken care of at all times. This film had so many concepts to play around with to the point that it may have seemed overwhelming at times, and this leads to inconsistencies among what should be brought up and some things not being developed at all. But overall, this is a good film, and while it's nothing crazy, it's definitely something to grasp the attention of all moviegoers alike, especially all the fans of Mr. Presley.